You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon and welcome to The Outcue. I'm Assistant News Director here at WFMJ, Breen Mitchell. And this is the second edition of The Outcue. To remind you, that's a new podcast that we launched just last week. It's a look behind the scenes of what goes into gathering the news. You know, the idea behind it comes from the fact that we just realized that if you're the viewer, what you see on YouTube versus what you see, present company excluded, what you see on YouTube versus what you see on a news broadcast might look similar. And a tweet might look similar to a headline. But what goes into it is very, very different. And what somebody can do from their living room based on an opinion is not nearly the same as the real work that goes into journalism. And so this is your peek behind the curtain at all of the work that goes into those few minutes that you might see on television, or those sometimes lengthy but still limited stories you may see on the website, particularly with a focus on our investigative work, which we pride ourselves on. So with me today is Madison Tromler and Robert McFerren, who have been at the forefront, along with myself, on a lot of work that we've been doing on the Youngstown City Schools. Now, this is a story that has spanned, we figured out just before we started taping that this has spanned literally half of Madison's career.
Yep.
And we've got two more stories this week that continue to delve into myriad issues in the schools, mostly dealing with their use of federal funds and local funds ever since the beginning of the CEO model, where the state took over the school district and allowed one person, initially Chris Mohib and then followed by Justin Jennings, to make financial decisions presumably in the best interest of the district. And now, fast forward, for various reasons, we do have a district facing a potential deficit of close to $17 million within the next couple of years. And that's after having seen an influx of cash from the federal government of $78 million. Now, for perspective, that's only $4 million less than the entire city of Youngstown got. And I believe it's more than the entirety of Mahoning County got, if I'm not mistaken. So what we want to do is start back to the beginning of how we began to start looking into this and what we've gathered so far and how much more there still may be to look into. So I'll start that because I took an initial phone call in August of 2022. Mm-hmm. An anonymous source who said that we should really be looking into a bus garage full of internet equipment that had no use and no home, that had been purchased by then CEO Justin Jennings as a part of a contract that would have been worth $17 million. It's about $5 million worth of equipment. So from there, you know, listen, anybody can call a newsroom and say anything. And we take a lot of phone calls, and a lot of them go nowhere. Some of them become single day stories. And some are what you call those too fanciful to be true. Those ones that are these big tips that you're going to look into and find something that just can't be quite right about it. There's got to be an explanation for it. And I'll be completely honest, this felt like it was going to fall into that realm. But the first thing you do is you gauge the credibility of the source, which of course I won't reveal here, but there was this initial source and we had to gauge how credible they were. And so what do? Well, we say, listen, I'm going to need documentation of anything you can show me. And they came through and they gave us some initial documentation. We reviewed it. They certainly appeared to back up that this equipment was purchased. But that's not enough. That doesn't tell me that it's untoward, and it certainly doesn't tell me that it's wasteful. So we took the step at that point, which is a bit of an extraordinary step, to meet in person, because this source told us that they had other sources for us and a lot more documentation. So at this point, I want to bring Robert into the discussion, because this is when we met with a couple of our sources together. And they started showing us documentation. And so, Robert, let's talk about that initial meeting and how we knew at least that we were dealing with credible people who knew something.
We went in, we didn't know what we had. We looked at the paperwork. We had a conversation that showed us that they definitely had something that they were in the know on. They had documentation that was backing it up, so let's take the next step, and we decided to look a little bit deeper and check with some other people to see what we found out. And what other sources you could provide, whatever documents you could provide, and here's where we are today.
Yep.
And from there, we develop, and this is largely now, Robert is done saintly work for cultivating more and more sources as a part of this, all of whom individually vetted, all of whom with various degrees of expertise and knowledge, and all of whom willing to share more and more. So that initial story was, it was a series of stories. And so Madison, refresh everybody what those stories were initially back that we finally, after working on from, so that first call was August, and then it was late March, early April of 2023 when we first finally got any stories on the air. And by the way, anybody who's watching this that ever knows anything and they want to work with us to make sure we know, not only will we protect you, but sometimes you have to be very, very patient. The due diligence sometimes takes time. So I remind you, this was a call in August, and they got no return on their investment until March, late March of the following year. They hung in there. We were trusting them, they were trusting us, and we were verifying each other along the way. So Madison, what were those first stories?
So about a year ago it was end of March of 2023, our first story was specifically looking into the internet equipment, and you laid out the timeline of everything really well because they got such a historical amount of those COVID funds compared to other schools. Like Warren got half that amount. So we were looking into this specific purchase, which was $10 million of this internet equipment and Jennings at the time had a plan to get internet access to the inner city families and make sure they have that to be able to do remote learning and have internet access. So, as you mentioned, Justin, they found that the equipment was sitting in a bus garage it's still sitting in a bus garage as far as we know, and that it was never compatible, it hadn't worked out, and it had been sitting there for so long. So that story specifically focused
and just to interrupt, I mean to interject, it wasn't compatible with the city's infrastructure.
Correct.
And this was purchased prematurely without a plan to work with the city on it, which is why once that equipment was there, contracts could be canceled. I mentioned it was a $17 million contract. They are not, to our knowledge, still paying that company for more equipment, but they are saddled with that equipment now because a decision that was made for arguably good reason, providing internet service to people in a city that has a high poverty rate, where certainly nobody is casting aspersions upon that. But that was why it wasn't compatible. I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that.
Right. And the city, the law director at the time, Jeff Limbian, had voiced concerns, essentially saying that due diligence needs to go into a major project like that. Like they have to make sure that the city equipment and the poles are owned by the city. For example, they need permission to use that stuff. So that was the first story, looking straight at that $10 million of the internet equipment that essentially went to waste. And then we did two other stories. We looked into COVID tests. The city, or the Youngstown City School District, had spent about $15 million.
$5 million, I believe it was.
Just on the COVID tests?
Yeah, it was, I think we reported it was around $3.4 million.
I believe that.
For the COVID tests,
Yeah,
but for other services, they had worked with QuickMed for other services as well. But our story focused on the COVID tests that we looked into at the time. The school district was getting some COVID tests for free from the state health department. And essentially we had some sources talking with Robert about how some of the COVID tests were not being used. So we looked into that.
And some ended up in the trash.
Right.
Yep.
And to be clear, they did get some from the state. This was a time when the state was offering them for free, and they were not putting a limit on how many a district was able to request. Youngstown requested 1,000. This is a district that has how many students in it?
About 4,600.
Yeah, okay, so about 4,600 students. So their request was less than a quarter of that, and yet they were spending this money on the
Right.
COVID tests. Again, a noble
Right.
cause to provide these tests for everybody, but there were questions about it.
Right. So that was the next thing. And again, these beginning stories were really looking at some of the major purchases at the time with the COVID funds, but we've also always watched the money in different school districts. And the other story that we did was looking at money they spent with their general fund on a payroll system
That was not compatible.
that was not compatible. So, and they had spent over $100,000 on
200 some thousand, yes.
Yeah, a smaller dollar amount, but out of the general fund. And again,
But important for a district that's struggling financially.
correct. And also, you know, seemingly a lack of due diligence because the money was purchased without knowing that it wouldn't be compatible with their existing computers. So those were the first three stories, but you know, I jumped ahead by talking about what the stories were. So now let's jump back. What did it take to get to those stories? I mentioned meeting with sources originally.
So we had everything. We had documentation. We had shipping orders from how the items that were sitting in the bus garage got here. So we were able to take those documents, go through and look at those FedEx shipping lists and see what was on there. I was able to go to these companies' websites and be able to verify pallet by pallet what was on each of those pallets to make sure what we were told and what we were being provided was accurate. And we did all this legwork before we talked to anybody about this.
Right.
a lot of math.
A lot of math, a lot of, you know, and we also had sources who were able to give us cell phone video of these pallets of equipment. So
Boxed.
Yeah, boxed.
Yeah.
So, okay, so now as you're piecing that together, what we're thinking is, okay, well, we've verified that there's something in this garage. And now by going pallet by pallet, that's how we verified what was in those boxes, because you were able to see these, well, I don't know if we're purchase numbers, SKU numbers,
Yep,
whatever they
yep.
were. And so now this is important because if you know all of this before you've spoken to anybody about it, you're able to ask informed and fair questions. This is not about playing a gotcha game, but it is about making sure you know what you're talking about before you go off. And also, it is about preparation. I mean, it's about making sure that you're not, sometimes you get one shot at an interview. And in that interview, you better know what you're talking about, because if they are able to deny anything that's plausible and you don't know that you're on the right track, a whole story, a whole investigation can fall apart in those moments. So after having verified the purchase orders, after having verified the payroll software, after having verified the QuickMed COVID tests, after having verified through multiple official sources now. So now I'm not talking anonymous sources. I'm talking about checking with the state, checking with the Department of Education, checking with health departments about how those tests were distributed, making abundantly clear that tests were available for free and there was no limit on how many you could request. Now that we've done all of this, it's time to put these questions to the district. So we need to speak to the CEO. We need to speak to Justin Jennings. How do we strategize that? If he's got something to hide, and at this point we don't know that he does. He may have good answers for everything, but you have to always be prepared for the potential worst where they just want to shut you down. Well, number one, at this point, we've got enough to report all of this and it be rock solid if we don't talk to them. So now talking to him is about fairness. It's about giving him an opportunity to respond. It's not about playing gotcha. We had the story no matter what. But you don't want to scare him off. So you need to be fair and let the source know this is what we want to talk about, but not necessarily make him think that you're out to get him, because again, you're not out to get anybody. Investigations are about, I spoke about this in the last one and I'll speak about it this time too. We're after the truth. That is the only thing we're after. We're not after agendas. We're not out to get anybody. We're out for the truth. So you want to reach out and you want to say, we want to discuss how the district has spent ESSER funds. ESSER is, I'm sorry, that's the term, think ARP money, but for schools. That's what ESSER funds are. But you don't necessarily want to say, I want to ask you why you spent money on COVID tests when the state was giving them for free, because he's going to think that's accusatory. And at this point, it's not accusatory. We just need these questions answered. And he, as the CEO of the district, is responsible for knowing how that money is spent. So it's fair to ask him to sit down and talk about how they've spent ESSER money. So we do that. And we do that again. We try and we try and we try to set up this interview. And finally, there's a school board meeting and they set some time aside. Now, this is a school board meeting during the time a broadcast is going to be on the air. Okay, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. So Madison doesn't anchor the news that night. I mean, as you all recognize, Madison sits in that chair and reads you the news every night. This night, Derek was going to have to go it alone. Madison's got to go try and talk to Justin Jennings. So Madison and Robert go to this meeting. So now let's talk about that meeting and what you guys noticed and what we asked him and what the general vibe was, because this investigation really took on a new turn with this conversation somewhat unexpectedly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we had all of our list of questions. We prepared a lot for this. We had meeting, just going over all of the information to make sure.
For months, we knew this at this point.
Yeah, and especially you guys had, even like a year, I think, even before I started being in on it, you guys, first got that initial phone call. So they were, once I started to familiarize myself with everything, and just because I've never done a story like this before, so I just had to learn a lot and understand all the details and make sure I felt confident and comfortable. So we went to the meeting, and I think we thought we were going to do before the meeting had started, but then
we had a limited window, so we didn't want to take a chance that we wouldn't have enough time to get all our questions in. So we decided we would wait till after the meeting so we could have additional time. Because
we wanted to have as much time as possible, because again, like Justin said, it's not a gotcha moment. It's about being fair, and as prepared as we were, we still, we could learn something from the interview, and you have to give the opportunity for someone to explain themselves and explain, what his role was and his decision making and spending all the money. So we had a lot of questions laid out, and I think and you also got into this a little bit, how you're not going to start an interview and be combative or seem. Not that we are combative, but you're not going to ask a question
I've
that's
been combative with some political interviews.
Well,
not in an investigation, right?
And combative might not be the best wording, but you don't want to ask a question that's going to set the tone for the entire interview right away. So we really were just asking about.
I'm here to learn.
Yeah, tell us about the spending, the ESSER, the COVID funds within the Youngstown City School District, and as we continued talking, he started talking about some of those things, the technology and the things that they're doing. And, it was just a conversation about, okay, well, why is the equipment still sitting in the bus garage? What's going on with that? And it was a calm, I think, our demeanor was calm, and but we kept asking our questions, and then, it did get to a point where I think he walked away.
How did he react? Yeah, what was his mood like? And how did you notice it shift?
Because you were standing there.
It was definitely a shock. I think that, he knew that we were talking about the pandemic and ESSER spending from the funds they received, but, and he started off talking about it, and I think he realized how much we really knew and had done our homework on this, and I think he was just trying to get the answers that, he felt he had to, and he was saying that, you can't fault me for this. I was doing proactive things. I was trying to be proactive on, it was a pandemic, but, it's a lot of money. You're hurting for money. You're in need here. So how do you justify spending this kind of money when you had other options available to you?
And did he really have answers for that?
No.
No. And that was the surprise, wasn't it? You would expect, again, he didn't know specifically what areas we were going to go into, but he knew that he had spent a significant amount of this money. Presumably, he knew where the money went. And yet, I can tell you that when you guys were telling me how that interview went, that was the thing that surprised me, was I really, really, really expected that he probably was going to have some answer. There was some missing piece. It was still going to be a story, but there was going to be something that he had to say, well, what you don't know is this.
Right, yes. And that is what I was thinking too. And that's the whole point of the interview, I think, is to give them that opportunity. And even as journalists, even though we did this investigation and found all of these things out, there's the hope that there is an explanation that we don't know. I always think about that. It's not like, oh, I hope that the story stays exactly. No, we shift where the story takes us. So, you know, that's the hope's always there for him to have an explanation. But he continuously said that he had the authority to do that. And I think it's important to point out, I think Justin did earlier, that that is the case because of the state. They passed legislation to allow there to be a CEO in the school district. So
to answer to the board or anyone.
Right.
He state approved.
And I think that's what's really, really important about all of these stories is that this is really not about one man and this is not really about one school district. It's about the fact that normally these kinds of decisions, especially for large purchase decisions, go through a number of people. But Youngstown schools were in a unique situation where one person was enabled by the state by law to make those decisions.
There was no transparency.
And without transparency. And so looking at how they spent that money is core journalism. I mean, there's no one's a king in a democracy, right? And so you can be a benevolent king, but you can still be a king in this district. And I just want to say also, just because we're going to get into more things that we've uncovered, you know, I'm rooting for the Youngstown City Schools. As a journalist, you don't root for a lot of things, but I can tell you I'm rooting for those schools to succeed and for a number of reasons. Those kids need that. And, you know, I'm a product of the Youngstown City Schools. I graduated from Cheney in 2001. Bob Spencer was the principal back then. Ben McGee was the superintendent. I go back a long way with this school district. There are kids in the city of Youngstown who sometimes that district is their last best hope. So this is not about tearing down a school district. This is about looking out for that school district. And I know I'm interjecting that maybe at an inopportune time, and I do want to get back to the Jennings conversation, but I think it's important everybody understand that.
That is the goal, and that's the intent of every bit of what we've done here.
So back to the Jennings conversation, his mood, how did you observe it shift? I mean, at one point, he ended the interview and said it was a witch hunt, did he not?
Right, yeah, and I know when I explained, I was like, and then he walked away. And I guess, you know, in the beginning, of course, he's very professional, of course, and we had met. I think that was one of my first times actually interviewing him, because I work dayside and a lot of the, you know, Youngstown, the school board meetings happen in the evening. So, you know, I was off the desk that day and got to meet him, but very professional. And as the conversation went on, it seemed, like you said, trying to process what we were asking, maybe nervous, I don't know, but at the end it seemed frustrated. He seemed frustrated with our questions, and he said it was a witch hunt.
Yeah.
His spokesperson said that we should be ashamed of ourselves.
Yeah. The other interesting thing of that night was there was two people in the audience that we were like, didn't seem to fit in with the crowd. And we wondered at that time who these two were and why they were there. But we didn't know.
And they hung around and they watched you guys do
They watched our interview. Everyone had left and they stayed for this.
And that is unusual. Now, we don't know to this day who those people were.
No idea.
But that's a good bridge, because as we keep looking into, you know, those initial stories air, months go by, and the next real thing that we're waiting for, I'm not missing any stories in between, right? I'm not jumping too far ahead, am I? We're watching for, I mean, there's fallout, obviously. The school board is asking for answers, things like that. But there's, we're waiting on a state audit because we want to see what they think about how the money's been spent and if they think anything is inappropriate. And a couple things happen very quickly this year in the course of the same week. The state audit finally comes out, and it calls into question some expenditures, not in terms of legality, but in terms of straight dollars and cents. Because remember, and I've said this a number of times already, all of these expenditures are born out of what would appear to be good ideas, and certainly on paper are necessary and allowable expenses. And that's what a state audit looks at, unless you get into special audits. So the audit comes out, and it doesn't call anything that we've reported into question, but it does note it, as well as some other expenditures. And it does point out that the district is facing this deficit. which leads us to, of course, start wondering, well, where did all of this go? I mean, we reported on a sliver of this money, but how are they this far in the hole? And so we go through the audit and we report on that. So that comes out on, and if I might remember the days of the week correctly, I believe that came out on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, the FBI moves into the Youngstown City Schools. They interview with several people. They take some documents and they put out a tip line. And now here's where this is, I'm going to have to word this carefully to make sure that I don't give any bad impressions. Yeah. On the same day, they do also raid QuickMed's offices and their CEO's home. They have not, and to this day, we are not in any way aware of any connection between the two raids. They did happen at the same time, and that's all I can tell you about that at this point. Mm-hmm. More will come out as whatever they're investigating unfolds. But that evening, the FBI takes a rather unusual step by putting out a tip line for anybody who has any knowledge regarding potential kickbacks related to contracts with the Youngstown City Schools since 2019, which of course was the time Justin Jennings took over. So I do think it's fair to say that Jennings and others in the Youngstown schools are under FBI investigation, and it makes us wonder who those guys at that meeting were, because the FBI doesn't jump in and do a raid without looking at you for a while. We don't know who those people were, but it would certainly seem that they were part of some surveillance that the district was under. And so now we've got to report on what's in the audit, and we've got to report what's in the tip line, what they might be looking for. But now this behooves us to go even deeper into the expenditures. So now back to the sources, who have expanded by large numbers at this point. I couldn't put a number on how many sources there are on this, but they all have unique areas of expertise, and they're all in the know. So we're able to start taking a look at all of the money now, not just a few contracts that we had questions about. So I guess, Robert, this would come to you now. What do we discover next as we start looking at the broad scope of these contracts?
So we start looking at the contracts to see who's getting the money, where is it going, why, we know this is federal funds, so we know that we have to watch and see how they're spending, and they report this. But it's a deep dive of hundreds at least of contracts that we went through line by line and looked at where the money went, what they got for this amount of money. Some were millions, some were, and we didn't really set a limit because we had contracts that were small amounts.
Sure.
That we had some that, I couldn't clearly tell what they were getting for it based on the contract they had. We just kind of went through and looked at it openly and said, okay, this is what we have. Here's what we know, what the contract or any invoice they had says they got for this amount, and that's what we reported then.
And the goal of this is not to cast aspersions on any of these contracts.
No, absolutely not.
Any of which,
potentially
all of them are legitimate. The FBI could still come up and say, you know what, all clear here.
And we knew the FBI was looking at the contract, so that's why we looked at the contract.
Right. Well, it's twofold. I mean, we know that the FBI is looking at the contract.
Don't know what they're looking for.
Right. Let's just say, here are all the contracts. Right. We don't know what's what, but we know that there are a lot, and it's a lot of money, and they are facing a deficit. So let's just straight black and white, where are the numbers? If this is a district with a general operating fund plus $78 million from the feds, and now they're facing a $17 million deficit, let's go through every dollar. Mm-hmm. And so, Madison, what did that involve on your end?
And I was just going to bring up, in looking at those contracts, let's kind of go over the things that we laid out and what, not that we can't say anything in the contracts, it's not our job to give our opinion on, this stands out to be strange or anything like that, but we laid out essentially what raised a question when we were looking over them or just wanted to know more about. And I'm trying to think right now which one I think we laid out first. We kind of went in order of how much we did categories.
Right, because we had to figure out what categories they fell into, whether they were in service, whether they were,
Yeah, and healthcare, kind of going back to the COVID test in the beginning, QuickMed was involved with the COVID test in the beginning, but overall healthcare was one of the biggest expenditures. And then staff training. And there were just a lot of different contracts with different coaches, motivational speakers, just a lot of guest speakers, and what seemed to be similar services between some different companies. And again, this may very well all be completely standard, normal. You know, it's hard.
You always have to acknowledge what you don't know. I've never run a school district, so
Yeah.
I am not equipped to say this looks like an outlier.
Yeah.
It might look like an outlier and I can ask questions, but it doesn't mean that I have any expertise to say it is. I want to go back to QuickMed real quick here again, just to make something clear, because they are the ones that got the most money from the Youngstown City School District. And so we did have to lay that out. Again, this is just factually, there were raids on the same day, so it does stand to reason that the first one you would look at is their contract with them, and they were getting the most money. But those raids might be unrelated. It is entirely possible that they're
we're not making any connections.
Incidental.
No.
And many of the services that they offer, they may be the only ones who offer, and they offer them in other school districts, and they are services that are required, that are necessary for these kids,
especially for a poor district.
So especially for a poor district. So again, it's just dollars and cents at this point. It's just where the money went.
And I did want to also add, because I just thought of this too, when we were, because a lot of these are local companies that the school was doing contracts with, and I called all of them and was trying to get a response from them, and a few of them hung up on me, some of these companies. So I noticed that, and then the only company I did hear back from was City Kids Care.
Well, we did hear from QuickMed too.
We did.
We had a statement already.
We had a few that did respond. We had a couple that didn't. But that's kind of what also led us then to this week's stories.
Right. Yeah. And that's just a part of these investigations, is you're calling all of these different people just to make sure that they have the opportunity to respond. So that was that story. And then, so now that we're at the point where we have this audit that came out in January of this year that pointed to the deficit, we've now been able to take a closer look in retrospect at what may have contributed to that deficit.
So external spending we've laid out, but there's also internal spending.
Yes. So in the audit, it lays out that there's some uncommon hiring of administrative staff. So more money than normal compared to other similar school districts are spent on administrative staff. So that's something that the audit pointed out and said that the Youngstown City School District should take a closer look at.
And that's why we took a closer look at it.
So that's the next part in our investigation, or in our series, is continuing to not only look back at now what we're learning from this audit, but also look forward into what the impact is going to be for the district, because now we have the teachers union, which has requested negotiations with the Youngstown Schools administration. And that's important because last year we know that there was a strike in Youngstown schools. So we kind of have all of these things happening at once. And now with the audit, we can look back, but we're also like, okay, all this stuff is happening. So what does it mean looking forward?
Right. And so, this is not, at this point, you would think that we've laid everything out, and these things keep popping up that are maybe not wrong, but unusual. So this administrative staff would be one of those things. And this is not being brought up by us. This is brought up by the state audit. They made several recommendations. And one of the notes that they made was that their teachers are underpaid, but that they have an unusually high number of central office staff, particularly these 28 or 29, what's the exact term for them? They're education coaches, essentially.
Yes, it's called educational administrative specialist.
They work with the teachers.
And they're like instructional coaches, and they specifically work with the teachers. But what is interesting and uncommon, the state auditor's office says, is that it is not a common position across peer districts. So we know one peer district just up the road is Warren City Schools. So
Almost identical.
yeah, very same number of students were, as we laid out in our story, same number of students, similar crime and demographics. They both have high poverty rates. So we looked into Warren. I spoke with the superintendent there, and they have no administrators with this exact title. They do have people that help teachers and students who are on special assignment, who they've brought in, about 8 of them, who are paid on like a teacher salary. They're paid similar as teachers are. They're not considered administrators.
And,
but
and what are these others being paid that are for Youngstown? Like the average salary?
it's $74,000, correct?
That's according to the audit. Yeah.
That's according, well,
on average. An
an
That's
average
actually-
of 74
yeah.
according to it's the state of Ohio. It's a data employment website for educators. So it's an average of 74,000 for these 29 additional administrators that Youngstown has brought on. And they say, the district has said that this is a part of their academic improvement plan. So
do they have a point there then? Because this is a district that's been struggling academically for a
Their
long
test
time.
scores have been on a decline except for the last
So-
year, a small increase.
yes, the last year there has been a very slight increase, but overall the district is still struggling academically a lot.
And so Warren doesn't use these. What are their scores like?
Warren has a lot of room for improvement as well. I think that's important to point out.
Yeah.
And Warren superintendent talked with me about that, and he's like, "Oh, of course, but they have seen some increase, a steady increase actually over the past decade without this amount of these types of administrators." And we talked about how they're each paid $74,000. And we added that up, and that's $8 million since they started hiring them. So essentially,
And based on an average, I mean, there
Based
are
on
some
an average.
six-figure salaries among these.
Yes.
74,000 is the average.
yeah. So essentially, we wanted to kind of look at that and make the point that without Warren spending $8 million, so it makes you question how, has this helped?
And we even went one step further that you checked with Akron. So a district that's 4 times the size. And what did you find out there?
They do
six.
use these, correct?
They do.
And they have 21,000 students.
And they had how many? 6?
Six of these instructors, yeah.
So guys, tell me this. How long have they had all these central office staff, particularly these education specialists?
So
Is it something they've had for a long time? Are we being fair? Have we given them a chance to work as we're looking at their test scores?
So they started hiring the instructors, the educational administrative specialists in 2015, which is the same time that the state took over the Youngstown City School District.
So there's the common thread. This is another expenditure that is allowed to be made unilaterally.
There was only one. For the first several years.
Yes. And then it was in 2019,
Which would be the same year as Mr. Jennings took over.
when Jennings took over, that it had increased to 15 of these instructors, Robert?
Yes.
And then from there, it has continued to increase. And again, the district points out that they do believe that it's sparking some potential improvement on the horizon. They pointed to they did point to one category on the last state report card that measures a spark of improvement across different subjects. But again, the overall school's rating has not improved.
It's been, I think stagnant's a fair term.
Stagnant. They used to have letter grades, so essentially it's still an F if they still had those letter
They
grades.
do stars now, but
Now they do stars, so it's still like 40-something%.
Also important to note that we did have a pandemic during the course of this.
Absolutely.
And that will affect scores for any school
And there were
district.
no scores given in 2019-2020 school year, so that's not even part of the
Yes.
factor. And then the following year, every school district saw a dip in their scores because they were already still recovering, still part of the pandemic.
And I'm
Right.
pointing all of this out just to make it clear, again, that none of this is about a gotcha.
No.
It could still bear out that all of this is a useful expenditure.
Right.
It's still an expenditure, and it still is something that now this board is saddled because they have the power now. This board and this new superintendent, Jeremy Batchelor, are saddled with coming up with a way to dig out of this hole, whether the hole is understandable or not.
That's our job as investigative reporters, to do our job.
And so we put that out there, and then it's your job as the viewer, the taxpayer, or somebody, a stakeholder in the district, to decide whether you think these were good expenditures. And you could very well decide that this was all them throwing everything against the wall to do everything they could for these kids. And if that's how you feel, then certainly that's how you should act as a citizen. Our job, though, is, and this gets back to the point of what we do and why we're explaining all of this in this podcast, is you don't have time to sit down and meet with multiple sources. You have families to feed. You have kids in school, particularly if they're in this district. You have jobs, maybe multiple jobs. You have bills. You have a higher cost of living in some cases than you've had before. You need to be able to trust that decisions are being made in the best interest of the constituency that you represent. And in order to be able to trust it, you need information. So that's what this is all about. This is about information. We are showing you where all of this is, because it's not as simple as, look, in a school district, there are always people, there are always rumors. There's always people who say things about the leadership. There's always, a union who's upset, or a former employee who doesn't like his new boss and he quit under bad circumstances. There's always somebody who doesn't like a leader's tactics. There's always somebody to say what's going on in the worst possible light. And they can put that on Facebook. They can tweet that. They can put out a YouTube video. They can tell their friends. And a group of people can believe whatever they're saying in the worst possible light, but it might not be based on any real information other than, I heard him say it, and he heard it from him, and he heard it from him, and they all put their own spin on it, and none of them did any of the work that we've done here. And by the way, it's not for them to do that work. They don't have time to do that work. I understand that. That's why we exist. This is public service, what we're doing here. And again, we want to serve our role in serving you, the public, and serving the people that need to be able to trust in those in power. But when you've got an extraordinary amount of power, you can't assume you have the benefit of the doubt, because quite frankly, you have the benefit of everything else. So where do we go from here, guys?
Follow the money. Again, we're doing this for the kids, and with any of our investigations, we don't determine where they're going. They determine themselves based on the information that comes to us.
Right.
We're not out there looking. They come to us, and if we feel that something that's a good point, let's take a look. That's how we go.
And I think with any investigation or any story that we do, there's ones that you continue to follow up with. There's ones that you continue to give your attention. There's ones that you don't. And I think in this case, we did continue to follow up on it, and because we continue to get calls into our newsroom and hear from people, and now we're at a point where what comes next is
the FBI, the investigation. I think they will tell us whether we're on a trail that is something that they think is, they're following or not.
And we don't know if that's related, but we know that that's happening. So how is that investigation, whether it has anything to do with spending within the district, how is that going to impact these children and impact this district and impact the teachers who are now facing a deficit and want to be paid more, probably? And
the audit pointed out that they are underpaid, but that's another part of the next step, is that we're on the precipice of union negotiations with the teachers union that is going to have to walk into these negotiations. Both sides are going to have to walk into these negotiations with the knowledge that, underpaid or not, according to the auditor, there is no money. And so how to not allow that to harm the district or lead to an exodus of teachers or lead to a cutting of resources. How do they chart a path forward where they keep people, they attract people, they don't lose resources, whether they be human capital or just learning resources, and how is that going to affect the children?
Yeah, and you have a situation where the district doesn't fully know what's going on right now, potentially. They may be questioning whether, if there isn't some sort of investigation or questioning overspending, what if
talking
that
about the board or
the school district,
Okay.
yeah, the board, the people, the administration, the treasurer, the people who actually look at the financial forecast, they may be wondering right now if there's potential for money to be clawed back.
And if that were to happen, then that 17 million would be on top of that, just to be clear. If there is something that's deemed to be
Right.
wrongdoing,
Right.
the auditor didn't claw anything back, but you don't know what
Right.
could happen
And-
with a serious federal investigation.
and
Right.
we're already talking that $17 million deficit projected for 2027 or 28?
28.
28. So
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
how do you save the district, educate the kids, and keep everybody happy?
Right.
And so this is now a large chunk of our work is looking forward to figure out what the best path forward is for everybody involved, and how to make sure that whatever happens, if it's going to be detrimental to the constituents of that district, that they're aware of what's happening. And that will include, by the way, anything that's spun a certain way, taking the spin away and just telling you black and white what it does and doesn't mean. You know, I mean, and this is not just the Youngstown School District. I mean, PR people, they get paid to take bad news and make it sound like it's at least neutral news or good news. And the fact is that there's going to be tough decisions to come forward, and we're going to be parsing through whatever they are. And we, again, are always getting at truth. We're always seeking truth so that you can make decisions about your lives and be informed to do so. Show that stack of paperwork again. I just, this is growing every day.
It's
And I mean, and this isn't just about this story. This is how, and his are so organized compared to mine, but this is how a lot of our investigations are. This isn't just like,
Oh, yeah.
you know,
This is just this
Yeah.
investigation. We have other stacks from
That's
other
all.
investigations we've done. We have other investigations we're currently working on.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a story that you want us to work on, we have an email, watchdog@wfmj.com. You can tell us, hey, I think you should look into this. And that's kind of, how, again, it started with a phone call.
Started with a phone call. Madison, final word from you?
I'm excited to continue to cover this. I think we're gonna, continue to tune in because we are gonna be watching what happens with this investigation and what happens with the teachers union, and we'll see what happens next. But it doesn't sound like the story's gonna go away anytime soon.
So that's it for this week, and I thank you for watching, and this has been the Outcue.